Hello, my name is Anwar Naseem. I'm an associate research professor at Rutgers University in the Department of Agriculture, Food, and Resource Economics. I, along with Carl Prey, manage the Feed the Future Policy Research Consortium that is funded as an associate award through SIL, and it's hosted at Rutgers University. And you'll be hearing more from Carl later on, as well as some of our other colleagues. Unfortunately, we couldn't get everybody in our consortium to be part of this presentation, but I hope that what you will hear will give you a flavor of our research program and the work we are doing. So in this presentation, I will start off by giving you a brief introduction to the consortium and who some of our researchers are and the various institutions and organizations that they are based at. I will then give you an overview of the mission and goals of the consortium. You will then hear from various colleagues who are working on the four main research activities, and I will go over these a bit later as well. Broadly, they're related to research on developing new indicators, our research on understanding the impacts of policy change and the policy process in general. A third area that we have been engaged in is to provide a better understanding of what contemporary agriculture transformation looks like and how the process of transformation can be made more holistic and inclusive, because we feel that the traditional view of agriculture transformation was somewhat limited and resulted in policies that were perhaps detrimental to agriculture and rural development. Finally, since the start of the pandemic, we have shifted some of our focus to COVID issues, such as developing a policy matrix and decision-making tool on how to keep agriculture food markets open. Laurie Post has been working on developing a COVID surveillance dashboard, again, to inform policymakers on what and when to have lockdowns and how to keep markets moving. And in the end, Carl will come in and close the presentation discussing some of the impacts of our work, some of the dissemination activities that we have been engaged in, and also our plans for the future. So our consortium consists of about 20 lead researchers across 11 institutions, 3 of which are in Africa. And although we have been with SIL since 2018, we actually got our start in 2015 through a funding mechanism that came through the Foreign Ag Service of the USDA, and we're grateful for the support they provided in the early phase of the consortium. One unique feature of our group is that it's very interdisciplinary. Although most of us are economists, we also have researchers from political science, anthropology, sociology, and health. So the consortium's overarching objective is to inform the policy process through evidence generated by rigorous research methods. And our focus is primarily on agriculture, nutrition, and food systems policy. And within this, we have various themes that we are working on related to agriculture inputs, nutrition, enabling environment, and resilience. And from the very beginning, our aspiration has been to identify policies that result in broad-based growth and agriculture transformation so that countries become self-reliant in their development pathway. And there are many different ways of getting at this. For example, you could look at the change in a certain policy and see what impact that has had over subsequent period. Or perhaps you could look at current state of affairs by collecting data and doing empirical analysis to see whether the current policy is having the desired impact, and if not, how it could be improved. So there's a big emphasis within our work is to collect the right data, do the correct analysis, and from that suggest some of the policy implications of that work. So to meet the consortium objectives, our work involves 3 interrelated research activities, as I mentioned previously, but I want to go over the highlights in the next few slides. The first is the development of new indicators and creating new data sets that can be useful in policy analysis. So you will be hearing from Sarah Young on a novel water security scale. Lori Post will discuss the COVID surveillance dashboard that she and colleagues have developed. Finally, Will Masters will discuss his work on indicators to measure the cost of nutritious diets and some of the policy implications that come out of that work. There's also some work that I've been doing jointly with Eric Riley related to Act Transformation. So that we're trying to develop an Act Transformation Index to capture the holistic nature of contemporary Act Transformation. And then we're also working to expand the journey to self-reliance indicators over a longer period of time to allow us to better understand the factors that result in changes in capacity and commitment indicators. Our second set of research activities are related to specific policies and impact of policy change. So what is listed here are 4 examples, but there are others that you can find on our website. So the first of these, as an example, again, is the impact of deregulation in agriculture input markets on productivity, specifically for the case of Kenya. And this is work that I, Carl Prey, and Lata Nagarajan at IFDC have been working on. Then there's the impact of Rwanda's consolidation policy and crop intensification on food prices and by extension on nutrition. And this is work that Dave Weatherspoon at Michigan State, as well as Amable Sambimana and Fidel Nyatanga at University of Rwanda are involved in. Chuck Moss has been looking at the persistence and resilience to the gains from a particular policy and programmatic intervention in Rwanda's coffee sector. And finally, you'll be hearing from Saweda about the policy implications related to Nigeria's fish and poultry value chain. Lastly, there is our work on contemporary agriculture transformation, and what I would like to highlight here is the collaboration between Samba Mbaya and Chuck Moss that investigates how policy intervention has instigated the process of agriculture transformation in the Senegal River Delta. So next, you'll be hearing from Sarah Young, and followed by Lori Post, Will Masters, and Saveda Liverpool-Tassi, who will individually talk about their research and the work that they're doing. And then Carl Prey will come towards the end to give us sort of a summary of all our work. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Sarah Young. I'm an associate professor at Northwestern University in anthropology and global health. I'm here today to talk to you about the household water insecurity experiences scale. So, everyone here knows we can easily measure household food insecurity thanks to tools like the HFIAS, whose development we can thank USAID for. And I was in Western Kenya. I had a large NIH grant about 8 years ago to understand the consequences of household food insecurity in the first 1,000 days. And that was great, but as it turns out, formative work showed us that food insecurity wasn't the only issue, that water was a huge issue in ways that I had no idea to expect. So alongside measuring household food insecurity, we developed a scale to measure household water insecurity, that's water access and use in households in Kenya. And it turns out it was phenomenally interesting and insightful. We saw all these relationships between water and economic well-being, nutrition, physical health, and psychosocial, like mental health, depression, and stress that we didn't expect. And all you have to do is open a newspaper to see that water insecurity, problems with water access and use, is not unique to Kenya. So me and 30 of my closest friends embarked on an odyssey to develop a sister scale for water. That's what the household water insecurity experiences scale is. And we did all kinds of statistical analyses on data from 28 sites across 23 low and middle income countries. It's a huge amount of work, but the scale is done and now the fun can begin. So what will this household water insecurity scale tell us? It'll tell us about the prevalence. We'll be able to benchmark household water insecurity for the first time ever. We do this every year with household food insecurity, but this will be, right now, Gallup in 2020, Gallup collected data in Countries Gallup World Polls collected data for countries in half the world, so half the world's population: India, China, Brazil, much of sub Saharan Africa, Bangladesh, some Latin American countries. And not only will we know the prevalence, in a lot of the world we'll know who is more vulnerable. Is it women? Is it rural populations, etc.? This is an exciting collaboration that you'll be hearing more about. The household water insecurity scale can also help us to determine health and economic consequences, tell us about food production even. Those 4 pathways that we saw in Kenya, we'll be able to expand those. Finally, we'll be able to monitor and evaluate interventions. So lots of times we do well counting, how many wells were built, how many boreholes were built. But what we really want to know is, how does people's experiences with access and use of water change? And I'm happy to say a lot of organizations are already starting to implement this scale as a way of evaluating. But all in all, what this will do is, taking all together, the household water insecurity experiences scale will help us to develop policies and support effective evidence-based decision making. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Lori Post, and I'm the director of the Buehler Center for Health Policy and Economics at Northwestern University. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my project, the Global SARS-CoV-2 Surveillance Project. Without question, SARS-CoV-2, the novel coronavirus that causes COVID-19, has resulted in an unprecedented pandemic in modern history, with significant morbidity and mortality, and it has deleterious impact on the global economy, violence, mental health, and food security. Public health surveillance informs the policy needed to eliminate COVID-19, which depends on a variety of metrics to identify high priority events. The problem with using standard surveillance systems is that it tells us what's happened. It's a backwards looking view of the pandemic. So if we want to inform policy to stop COVID transmission and to inform policies that will curtail COVID transmissions and death, then we need to have a better view of what's about to happen. And to that end, we created a variety of surveillance metrics that can measure the dynamics of the pandemic that are more useful than traditional. For our project, we use surveillance metrics, including standard ones. So the SARS-CoV-2 Global Surveillance Project provides standard surveillance metrics that are useful and allow us to compare regions, even though they are limited to the more severe cases, and they suffer from incomplete case ascertainment and data contamination. To address these data limitations, we validated additional novel surveillance metrics of speed, acceleration, jerk, 7-day lag, and 7-day persistence. We measure the speed of COVID transmission, which is basically the basic indicator of the pandemic status on a given day, which is the number of new cases on that day. Since new cases per day is a rate value per unit of time, we will allow physics nomenclature and refer to this as the speed of the pandemic. This is consistent with heuristic descriptions of the pandemic as spreading rapidly. For example, a large number of new cases per day, or slowly, a small number of new cases per day. The public health ideal is to bring the speed of the pandemic down to 0. We also created a new metric called acceleration. We are also interested in whether the number of new cases per day is increasing, peaking, or decreasing, and why. Again, we will adopt physics nomenclature and refer to this as acceleration. Since acceleration is difficult to ascertain on a daily basis and there are weekend effects, the data, we report the weekly average for the acceleration. A positive acceleration indicates an increasing number of cases per day, and a negative acceleration indicates a decreasing number of cases per day. An acceleration of 0 is indicative of a peak, a valley, or an inflection point, depending in part on whether the previous acceleration was positive or negative. Our next indicator is the jerk. We now address the question of whether the day-to-day increase or decrease in new cases the current week is bigger or smaller than the day-to-day increase or decrease in new cases compared to the past week. Using physics nomenclature, the difference between these two acceleration rates is the jerk. A positive jerk indicates that the acceleration in the number of daily cases this week is greater than the average growth last week. Such a finding would be consistent with a scenario in which the pandemic was experiencing explosive growth, where a policy shift such as reopening had augmented the acceleration of the pandemic, possibly including a shift from deceleration to acceleration, or where super spreader events had jerked the acceleration upward, among other scenarios. Our final novel metric is what we call the 7-day persistence effect, the statistical impact of the 7-day lag of speed on today's value of speed. New cases per day tend to have an echo effect 7 days later, similar to the echo effect in the population pyramid caused by the baby boom, reported as the weekly average number of new cases per day that are attributable to the weekly average of the 7-day lag of the number of new cases per day. In summary, the basic questions we are trying to inform is, how are we doing this week relative to the previous weeks? From a public health perspective, in the midst of a pandemic, we would like at least 3 affirmative responses. 1, there are fewer new cases per day this week than last week. 2, the number of new cases is declining from day to day. And 3, the day-to-day decline in number of cases is even bigger this week than last week. Additionally, we would like some indicative information about significant shifts in how the pandemic is progressing. Positive shifts could be the first indicators of the emergence of a new or a recurrent hotspot, and negative shifts could be the first indicators of successful public health policy. In summary, the Global SARS-CoV-2 Surveillance Project measures how the pandemic is progressing in 200 countries.
I'm Will Masters from Tufts University. Really happy to be able to share our work in Malawi, leveraging work that we do in a number of other East African countries, in Ethiopia and Tanzania, on other projects with the Rutgers Consortium, have been looking very closely at this holistic question of the overall cost of nutritious diets, looking in a systemic way across all the different food groups and using data from the government of Malawi in support of the Malawian government's efforts to look across all different kinds of foods, not just maize and their traditional focus on food security, but thinking about nutrition. So taking data from market prices that are collected by the National Statistical Office of Malawi to monitor inflation. We were able to get file data from a whole decade of individual item prices and match every one of those items to the nutrient composition of each food that comes from the new food composition data assembled by the Nutrition Innovation Lab, and match that to health data on the nutrient requirements for an active and healthy life, and run a model which estimates accounting for substitution between foods, depending on the season and the location, using whatever happens to be available at that local marketplace. And we have data from 29 different marketplaces every month for about a decade. And what you see is the pattern in this chart, which is very strong seasonality. So that's a subject of our latest paper in Science Advances. Extreme seasonality that you can see in this chart, with a pattern of prices that is consistently very, very high. So just below the $2 a day, you can see on the axis is the World Bank poverty line of $1.90. The Malawian government's own poverty line is $1.40. And most respondents in a survey, this cost ranging between $1 a day and $1.50 a day is in excess of all of what they spend on everything. And so that's our central finding, is that the daily cost of a diet with adequate nutrients for a healthy life would exceed total household expenditure. Everything these households spend on. For most Malawians, this happens to also be true for a slight majority of all people in all of Africa. So Malawi is not exceptional in this way. It's just an extreme instance of a pattern that we see around the world. And the central implication of that is that the actual diets that we know people consume, which fail to reach nutrient adequacy, that's fundamentally because of low income and high food prices. The issues that we are concerned with in the United States or elsewhere about food choice and nutrition knowledge, that's all, of course, very important, but very important only when healthy diets have become affordable, and that's not the case in this context. There's nothing that these households could possibly do to reach nutrient adequacy. So what we conclude from that is that the holistic perspective of a food systems approach that looks across all food groups at all nutrients, accounts for substitution, thinks about seasonality, thinks about spatial variation within Malawi. Once we do all that, what we conclude is this really clear need for productivity growth across all major food groups, not just maize, not just starchy staples or even pulses, but across all the food groups that you saw on the previous slide. Stabilize those so there's less seasonality, achieve more uniform prices nationally through transportation improvements, but absolutely crucially, safety nets plus income growth that can make those foods affordable for the poor. Thanks very much.
Hello, this is Sawida Liverpool-Tassier, and I'm presenting on behalf of Thomas Reardon and myself from Michigan State University. We're really happy to have the opportunity to share with you some of the work that we have been doing in Nigeria in partnership with the Rutgers Consortium, as well as the USAID Nigeria-funded Nigeria Agricultural Policy Project, where we use collaborative research teams composed of MSU faculty working alongside Nigerian faculty and students to conduct research to feed into the policy process in Nigeria. And today I'm just going to be sharing some work that we have done on the poultry maize value chain in Nigeria, a highly commercialized subsector which engages over 1 million people directly in terms of jobs, and for which the supply chains that move the food and products are extremely important. We used what we call stacked survey data collected in 2017 and 2018 along selected nodes of the poultry and maize value chain, as you can see in the diagram. And then we use that to understand the structure, conduct, and performance of the subsector. But then we have supplemented this information with calls to these economic agents or a subset of them to document the effect of COVID-19 on their activities and also how they're responding to COVID-19 policy responses. I'm going to just spend some time talking about one of the key findings that we have been able to document in this work that I think is currently relevant, which is how policymaking generally and then specifically during COVID-19 really have been built on sort of a wrong set of premises about food supply chains, which we call myths. I want to quickly summarize 4 main points that we tried to highlight in the paper that I showed on the previous slide on our COVID-19 related work in Nigeria. The first is the myth that imports are a big share of food consumption in Nigeria. Prior to COVID, this led to a focus on things such as import substitution, and then during the COVID, it led to a focus on ports and cross-border movement of goods and people. But the reality is that imports are less than 10% of food in terms of tonnage in Nigeria, and domestic production actually accounts for over 90%. Thus, the policy debate and actions should have been focused on domestic supply chains. The second myth has to do with the importance of lateral supply chains to food supply chains. Lateral supply chains such as banking services, input supply in some cases, third-party logistics, these are all crucial for the efficient operation of the main food supply chain. Prior to COVID, lack of recognition of their importance led to an underinvestment in roads and poor policies for transport, things like truck registration and the like. And during COVID-19, or in the policy response right at the beginning of the pandemic, this led to many of these important lateral services not being considered as essential services. And so what this did was to significantly hamper the operation of food supply chains, because the reality is that third-party logistics and these lateral supply chains are extremely important for food supply in Nigeria, as most of the food and food products are moved by these third-party logistics. So the policy debate and actions should have been focused on keeping these food supply chains working and recognizing the importance of these lateral supply chains. The third myth or misconception is the fact that there is this missing middle in food supply chains, and that small and medium-scale enterprises in trading, processing, logistics are stagnant and already constrained. But this prior to COVID has really led to an underinvestment in creating an enabling environment for these small and medium-scale enterprises for the operation of wholesale and retail markets prior to COVID-19. And then during COVID-19, there was a lot of restriction to the operations of these small and medium-scale enterprises. But restricting these small and medium-scale enterprises really hurt food supply chains and employment particularly for women. The reality is that these actors in the midstream are not missing. They're hidden from policy debates and from the literature in many cases, but they're actually very dynamic and extremely important for the operation of food supply chains. The last myth is this idea that rural households are largely subsistence, both on the input and the output side, are largely subsistence and have limited commercialization, both on the input and output side. And so supply chains going to rural areas are not as crucial to think about. And this led to, prior to COVID, underinvestment in the infrastructure that reaches to rural areas. And then during the pandemic and during the lockdown or post the policies in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, there's not been as much attention paid to the rural areas, feeling that they're sort of isolated or less affected by the pandemic. But the reality is that 60% of the food consumption in rural Nigeria is actually purchased. So these food supply chains are extremely important for them as well. Many of them are actually highly commercialized. Farmers are using fertilizer, and the subsectors like the poultry are highly commercialized. Over 80% of poultry farmers, for example, in our sample, are selling a majority of their products to the market. So severely restricting input supply chains hurt farms, both crop and poultry, during the COVID-19 era and before. So policies really need to be focused on keeping food supply chains broadly operational and generally trying to ensure that the bottlenecks to their effective operation are minimized. And of course, if there's any further lockdowns, then particular attention needs to be paid to how to keep these food supply chains operating, but adhering to the necessary protocols. And so I think I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Greetings. This is Carl Prey, and my job is to tell you about one other example of our research on response to COVID-19, and then to lead us through how policy research, and ours in particular, leads to development outcomes, and to talk about some of our future plans, and then conclude this session. So with respect to COVID-19, as no doubt you know, after having a relatively limited impact in Africa until about October of last year, we're now in a situation where Africa's caseload is growing rapidly and is spiking in some countries like Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt, which means we need to continue this research considerably further. The focus of our research is the supply of agricultural innovations, and the major contributor in Africa is the public sector research system, which so far has provided extremely high social returns to government investments, and so is a worthwhile investment for donors and countries. To see what kind of impact COVID was having, we surveyed 50 plus key informants from African and Asian research systems. And the findings were somewhat as expected. Research productivity, at least temporarily, declined due to closures of offices and labs, to travel restrictions, shortages of supply. At the same time, R&D expenditure was down, and for the near future is likely to decline in most countries. In South Africa, for example, there's been a 20% reduction in research funding already, along with all funding for government programs. Private sector, on the other hand, has been fairly steady in funding as far as we can tell. At the same time, there are opportunities in the medium term for growth and productivity growth in the research system due to COVID pandemic. It's an opportunity to change research priorities, an opportunity for early retirement programs. It is an opportunity to put new skills and techniques to use, lab science from agriculture or learning new skills working with COVID-19 labs. Greater access to genomics, gene editing, big data can lead to big opportunities for future productivity. And there's the opportunity to build political support for agricultural research by strengthening their by showing the government that food security depends on agricultural research. The next slide really shows a simplified model of the way we get from research outputs to development outcomes. And it's not a very straightforward path, and much less straightforward perhaps than some of the technical sciences and their research. So the research outputs come in the form of publications, et cetera, and these then are distributed to research users in a variety of ways. These include the USAID mission, governments, civil society, private sector, et cetera. And these research users put this together with the politicians and with regulators, and the result are these research outcomes, which are improved policies, more efficient policies and regulations, and perhaps more efficient investments in public goods such as research, environment, and resilience. And the ultimate development outcomes, which is what aid in the countries are most concerned about, are the greater productivity of farmers and of the market system, lower food prices, perhaps low transactions costs and regulatory burden, and improved nutritional and health outcomes. This is all showing a one-way path from research to development outcomes, but good research has to have pathways back from each of these things, feeding back into the research output or research process and making it work more efficiently. Some of our research outputs include peer-reviewed journals, often with African scholars, conference presentations, both for academia, for donors, for policymakers, support for PhD and master's students in the US, and support for African students working on their master's degree in Africa. And some other examples of the pathway from output to research users include some of the work, for instance, in Nigeria again. Sawida and Tom are working on the food supply chains with two major regional universities in Nigeria and with regional policymakers. And so this collaborative process automatically provides information to the research users, and hopefully some of it gets used in policy and regulations. There are also targeted background papers. One example is a series of studies we did on early generation seed systems in 2016-17, which helped influence AID's investments in research, investments in early generation seed systems, and ultimately, hopefully, seed companies and farmers. In the future, we're going to be doing more, putting more emphasis on SIL's goals and on self-reliance. Some of these include expanding the analysis of policies that supported the resilience of maize, poultry, fish supply chains in Nigeria during the pandemic, making use of our indices such as HWISE, nutrition, COVID-19, and transformation to assess policies for sustainability and for resilience. And finally, extend our current analysis of factors explaining USAID's journey to self-reliance and determining which factors are the really important ones that aid and countries need to put more emphasis on. So with that, I thank you, and I think it's the end of this session, and we're looking forward to your questions and comments.